I'm Datsunn, and people said you couldn't flip Olivia Dean.
Said nobody.
But let's talk about how I did. Let's just cut straight to it. This beat was so hard to get through. I'm going to break down what my setup is, and then how I kind of approached actually chopping this sample. Because man, in the end, this one took me easily 100 plus takes. And I know, yes, I could just map out the drums and play a loop through and then go through and layer the chops, but there's something about this that's different than just sequencing it all. I've been asked so many times, like,
why don't you just loop the drums and play the chop?
But there's something so interesting about the performance you get in the end when you actually play the entire beat out. It's not to say you can't go back and layer sounds, like adding bass lines if there isn't a bass line in the track, or just more layers and textures to it. But when it comes to playing the drums and the chops, there's just something really unique about it and an improvisational aspect to the outcome. So my setup goes as follows. Generally, when I'm playing live beats on the push now, I like to reserve these 8 pads right here for drums. And then these 2 right here are copies of these hi-hats. Same exact hi-hats. Just so that when I switch over to this half of the chops, I can continue with those. And then I can leave these green pads that you see here open for effects. And that for me is like almost like having the machine and the SP404, but in one rig. So most of the drum sounds you hear are from my latest pack, Crate Knowledge. More info in the description below if you want to check out those sounds. Let's go through the drum sounds. Kick, snare, closed hat, open hat, and then this extended ride, and then I have a crash. And then I'm not using these 2, but they're just some tom sounds. And then over here, like I mentioned, I have a duplicate of my closed hat, and then a duplicate of my open hi-hat. These pads are all sound effects. I might have not even triggered some of them in this beat, depending on if my brain can move quick enough to actually trigger multiple sounds. But I've got big siren. The rest of the samples here are sample chops. There are only a few that I don't use in this track, which is crazy to think that most of these are actually getting used. It kind of blows my mind. But what we have is the beginning of the chop and then kind of where I end the whole phrase. So, this one's a little bit more surgical in a sense, where I'm kind of flip-flopping back between certain patterns, but for the most part, it's still linear in that I'm going from left all the way to right and then all the way to the end. I didn't manage to fit the top 3 chops here just because they didn't fit within the context of how I was playing the beat. Let's go through it. Like I said, it's really simple in terms of how I chopped it. So I've got the main sample pitched up.
Turn around. Since when are you smoking now? It's been a while.
So that little section kind of became most of the verses in this beat. I've got the screen recording here so you can see it. We've got main chop, and then I don't really hit those pads. What I generally do is go through and I'll chop all the sections I think I'm going to want, and then I kind of refine it over time as I start to work through the pattern and what I eventually want to end up at. In this case, I'm just going. And then I like. So you can kind of see where I'm like playing back and forth and keeping these 2 pads as my main chop. My method is always start with the sample, duplicate that chop over to the next pad, and then start from where I ended off. So I can kind of slowly, you can tell how the sample gets shorter and shorter and shorter here. So I kind of skip there. I like to find pockets of space where there aren't vocals, or maybe the tail end of a vocal, to then find a smooth chop between a few pads like this. I don't mind that you know? And then, and same goes for, and that's the beauty with it, is you can kind of play around with cuts from these vocals where like, did you? You know, like throwing in those little moments where, I love throwing in those micro chops where you just kind of poke the word in and take it out, you know? It feels like foreshadowing in a way. A part that was really, really difficult for me was actually figuring out the length of these verses and some of these, what I call pre-choruses in this case, where, you know, the pre-chorus is quite short in this, but going into, because I really wanted to feature at least one time in the beat, and a couple minutes. I wanted that a couple minutes because, hey, it's the sample. I want to make sure those words are in the chop. So,
have a couple minutes and already kind of feels like back on your sofa. Of course I still can. Love's never wasted when it's shared.
And then,
back on your sofa. Of course I still can. Love's never wasted.
this part of the chop was really melting my brain because it's not quite the same as it progresses. The hits are a little bit different. Sometimes I don't question myself in the process and I just keep moving ahead, even though maybe I could have simplified the chop to be more for all of them, except it goes one, two. And then again.
Back on your sofa. Of course I still can. Love's never wasted when it's shared.
All right.
Back on your sofa. Of course I still can. Love's never wasted when it's shared.
You know, as much as it's kind of all over the place in terms of rhythmically where the chops are happening, it still works, especially because it's a 16th note hi-hat, which allows me to kind of fine tune those chops instead of trying to fit them in between like an 8th note hi-hat pattern or something like that. Yeah, in hindsight, I probably could have simplified the chop to make it easier on myself because I made the beat, I filmed a video, and then I didn't really pull it out again until wanting to film this breakdown video. And it took me probably 30 minutes of going back through it to relearn those chops because I had to rewatch my own video to be like, what did I do in that again? You know, once I sort of figured out that chop, at the same time, I was working on the drum pattern and I found that drum pattern where it's like, was one that really worked for this. So let's go over this really quick on how I brought the drums in, and then I'll take you through my drum rack setup and we can wrap it up with the beat. All right.
Turn around, since when I get smoking
And then again. so much fun to play, but it's a real again, like I said, it's a real brain melter. So let's go through my drum rack setup. It's fairly simple in terms of the way it's all routed and stuff, but I group my drums and I group my chops within the actual drum rack chain here. And the reason I do that is just so that A, I can stay organized with it, and B, I can just put a side chain on this chops group instead of each individual chop. And that way I can still have a side chain and not totally crush my CPU. In my drum chain, I just have my drums set up here, nothing special, but on the drum group itself, I love using drum bus or knock, depending on what I'm feeling exactly, but it's nice because it gives a more finished and polished sound to your drums rather than them just being one shots left out in the open, or having to individually go crazy on compression and saturation on the one shots themselves. It's nice to just kind of put one on the group. Drum bus and knock work really great for that. So definitely, if you don't use either of those, highly recommend it. And that's really all I have on my drums. Like I said, it's just using one plugin for that entire chain. And then my chops, I have my sound effects and the chops in one chain. Again, just to simplify and have the same side chain on all of them. The side chain that I'm using, it's Delta by Nest Acoustics. I've talked about this plugin before. An amazing sidechain plugin. If you've never used it, again, highly recommend it. Check it out. And then I just have an EQ that kind of rolled off some of the top end. Felt a little bit almost too saturated and too bright. I wanted a little bit more muted in a way. And then all my chops here are in the same choke group. So I have them set to choke group number 1. That way, doesn't matter where I'm hitting it, it cuts off the last pad. That way you can kind of play over it. One thing I've been asked, and I've talked about it in Machine so many times, all of my sample chops, I fix the velocity on them in Simpler. So I'll go in and just set the volume velocity percentage down to 0% and then bump the volume up a little bit because that definitely makes it a little bit more quiet. But that way, it doesn't matter how light or hard I hit the chop, it's still triggering at full volume. Whereas the drums are definitely left more open. Sometimes I'll make it so that the kick, maybe not in this instance, the kick is slightly more fixed velocity. That way, if I mistrigger it, it doesn't just disappear. Maybe it's the drummer in me. I love retaining as much of the dynamics as possible. Even when we're talking about just one shots, though they're not hyper sampled and you're just triggering the one shot at different volumes, that can still give you a sense of dynamics. That way you can kind of emulate a little bit more of what a real kit would feel, even if they're more digitized sounds. It gives you a little bit more feel. The setup is quite simple. The chop was quite complicated, but the result in the end, my goal is to always try and make a dope track. Although I'm playing all of it live, the goal is not to just be how can I impress people by playing this live? It's not always about being too showy with it. It's about what serves the track the best, And in the end, you still get something that you can listen to without having to rely on actually watching a video to be impressed by it or to enjoy it. If you have any questions that I may not have covered, please drop them in the comments below. One thing I didn't touch on is the mix. I mix as I go. If the snare feels off, I find a way to get it to sit in the mix. If my drums don't feel like they're sitting, I spend time during the process to get everything to sit right so that the end result already feels mixed. Make sure to go check out my latest pack, Crate Knowledge, Boom Bap Reimagined. So many drum breaks, 250 sounds total. There are compositions to be chopped, breaks to be chopped, tons of one shots and sound effects. I'd love it if you went and checked it out. Everything in the description below. Y'all, thank you so much for tuning in with me. Let's run through this track and end this off. Thanks so much for watching, y'all. Have a great day. Peace.